Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Vibe podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the Gospel of Mark is fake history. Was Jesus Christ fabricated? Is the whole Jesus character a deception? Did he actually exist or did he not exist? That being said, RG Price, it's good to have you back on the show. It's been a while.
Yep, good to be back.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. And you have a presentation that you want to share, so I'll just go ahead and put it up on the screen and we can just go from there.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess everybody that's or people that are here may be familiar with some of my prior presentations or my book Deciphering the Gospels Proves Jesus Never Existed. I've been working on a new book ever since that one came out in 2018. But in the process, I've basically written about 4 books trying to get to, or wasn't really trying to get to, but ended up, as I would get through one book, I would think, well, this isn't really quite good enough, so then keep going. So that's why it's taken me quite a long time. But one of the major, I guess I would say, findings that I've had in a lot of the analysis that I've done, and what my new book that is currently, the first draft is about 90% complete. I'm trying to get it finished up and then get this thing published. What it really focuses on a lot is dealing with whether or not the current form of the Gospels in the New Testament is actually the original form of those Gospels. So, in other words, are the Gospels that we find in the New Testament original as the way that they were originally written, or when the New Testament was put together, were those Gospels edited, modified, and revised? And so, what I put forward in the book is a lot of analysis to show that the Gospels, as they exist in the New Testament, are not the original versions of those Gospels, and that they were modified collectively by the editors. Now, I've got many examples in my book. I'm not going to go through all of those. What I'm going to talk about today is just the issue of whether or not Jesus was said to have come from Nazareth. And the reason I'm going to talk about this subject is because this is something that's been already addressed by some other people, and so this is not completely new and unique content to my book. And I don't really want to discuss a lot of the stuff that's sort of new and unique to my book until I get it published and get it out there. But this is something I'm willing to go ahead and talk about because I'm not the first person to address some of this stuff. So like I said here, the big question is are the Gospels in their canonical forms really the original versions of these? Now, what traditional biblical scholars have worked under the assumption for a long time, that the Gospels as we have them in the New Testament are essentially exactly or close to exactly the same as what the original writers of those works were. That whenever the New Testament was put together, all that was done is a writing that was circulating independently was put into a collection, maybe giving a heading and given maybe some minor modifications to the ending, something like that. But for the most part, the rest of it, the assumption has been unmodified through its transmission, and it reflects what the original author wrote. And that's what I'm, questioning and calling into. What I'm analyzing here is whether or not that's the case. So, as I said, what I've seen in my book is, in the analysis that I've been doing for my book, is that there are many indications that the Gospels have been modified collectively, in other words, harmonized to each other, so that whoever edited the 4 Gospel collection or the New Testament collection made modifications to each of the Gospels to bring them more in line with each other. And primarily what they were doing was bringing these Gospels in line with the Gospel of Matthew. So the Gospel of Matthew can sort of be thought of as the prototype Orthodox Gospel, where the Gospel of Matthew was sort of written by its author with the most, what we would call today, Orthodox types of claims in it. And of course, the Gospel of Matthew is not an original work itself. It is derived from other Gospels. But once that Gospel of Matthew was written, and then the other Gospels were put into a collection with it, what the book I'm working on shows is that the other Gospels were then modified to share some of the points that were made in Matthew. Now, one of those things is this idea that Jesus is from a town called Nazareth, right? And currently, each of the four Gospels says explicitly that Jesus is from Nazareth. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the mentions of Nazareth and identifying Jesus as a Nazarene in the Gospels is that when you read English translations of the Gospels, there's a lot that gets glossed over and sort of harmonized, and a lot of the kinks that sort of get worked through in the translations, where they modern translators, especially in English, sort of gloss over a lot of the differences, different spellings and things like that that are in the underlying Gospels. Now, there's essentially two different ways that this title of Nazarene are spelled across the Gospels, and there's two or three different ways that the name of the town of Nazareth is spelled. And what we see here is basically in purple, we've got this, what I would call the Marcion spelling, which is this really Nazarenos spelling. Now, Nazarene is sort of the word that we typically hear, used to talk about, to describe Jesus as, someone from Nazareth. But Nazarene, I would say, is probably not really the best possible way to say that. It would really be Nazarenos, which for reasons that we'll get into later. But this is this Nazarene root, and then these different spellings that you see are really just different forms of the word in Greek in different contexts. That's all fine. But then we've got this other spelling in blue, which is, I would say, is what we're calling the Matthean spelling. Now, whether or not this really originated with Matthew, I'm not so sure, but this is the Nazorios spelling. And so we've got these two different spellings for this title. And with Nazareth, interestingly, we have this Nazara or Nazara root word here that is used in Luke, Matthew, and the Evangelion. And then we've got Nazareth with a theta on the end, and then a Nazareth with the th on the end. With the theta on the end, and then Nazareth with the ta on the end. So with all these different spellings, it may seem like, well, there's just variety of ways people spell things, but there's actually some pattern to this, and some indication of how use of these terms and how they thought about these words changed over time. Now, one of the most interesting here is Luke, and you can kind of see that Luke is the only one of the Gospels that mixes these two different spellings, where you've got Nazarene and Nazorios, and as we've talked about in the past, and I think many scholars have talked about now, is this idea that the canonical Gospel of Luke is built from a proto-Luke, and that both Matthew and Luke used proto-Luke. And the writer of the canonical version of Matthew took proto-Luke and then primarily added chapters 1 and 2, the birth narrative, made some modifications to the ending of the story, and then made a few modifications throughout the narrative as well. But for the most part, Luke 3 through 23, or 3 through 24 and a half, or half of 24, is mostly proto-Luke. And the canonical writer mostly just wrote Luke chapters 1 and 2, made modifications to the ending, and then modified, about 5 or 10% of the content from Luke 3 through 24. There's very few changes, but one of these changes appears to be this addition of Nazorios here, which is why we have this mix of spellings, where we've got the spelling here from Proto-Luke of these parts of the mentions of Nazarene that came from Proto-Luke, which had been derived from Mark, and then the introduction of this newer spelling. And this is interesting also because in Acts of the Apostles, it's only this sort of Matthean spelling, or this newer spelling, that is used throughout Acts of the Apostles. So Acts of the Apostles mentions quote unquote Nazarene, or describes Jesus as a Nazarene 7 times, and uses this spelling in all 7 of those. And that's the spelling that we see matched in canonical Luke here as well. So this is just some of the background here of the information that we're going to be analyzing. And a lot of this, there's a lot of work on this that comes from this article that was published by Spin from the Early Christian Writings Forum, called Nazareth and the Evolving Synoptic Tradition. And you can look that up on academia.edu if you're interested. It's definitely a worthwhile paper to read. So with what we'll be discussing, just to orient you to the framework a little bit, I feel like every time I come on here, I have slightly different interpretation of how these gospels relate to one another. But the framework that I'm sort of using here, and the way I'm thinking about this, is something like this, where there was an original version of Mark, and from this was derived a proto-canonical version of Mark. Now, this original version of Mark was quite different from the current canonical version, and I'm not going to get into that in this call. Is too much to get into, but it's not really relevant to this discussion, because with this discussion we're basically dealing with proto-Mark, and then we've got an original version of the Gospel of John and a proto-canonical version, which was very similar to the current canonical version, and then an original version of Luke, which many people also call Proto-Luke. And from that, the Gospel of Matthew is derived from this original version of Luke and the proto-canonical version of Mark. But what we see is that these canonical versions of these Gospels have all been influenced by the Gospel of Matthew and by each other. And so these were all edited. What I'm proposing is these are all edited together with editors having full knowledge of all the other writings and modifying each of the writings together to make them agree with one another more than what they originally did. Now, my view really is that these earlier Gospels, Luke, Mark, and John, are really what would be called non-Orthodox Gospels, or maybe even heretical Gospels. So the original versions of these really were quite different from Christian Orthodoxy. Matthew was what I would call the first truly Orthodox gospel that was written. And then once this 4-gospel collection was created, or possibly even the broader New Testament collection was created, which I think would have happened in the middle of the 2nd century, that's when all of these gospels were modified together and brought into their Orthodox forms. So just to get started looking at, all of this in Mark, we're introduced to this idea that Jesus is from Nazareth with the Gospel of Mark, under the assumption that Mark is truly the first gospel that was written. Now, if you're reading the New Testament, of course, that's not going to be the case. You're going to be introduced to this through the Gospel of Matthew, because that's the first gospel in the New Testament. But knowing that Mark, or believing that Mark is the first gospel to have been written, the way that it reads currently is in Mark 1, verse 9, we're told that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. And then later on in that chapter, there's the scene where Mark is confronted by a man with an unclean spirit, right? Where Jesus is dealing with a man with an unclean spirit. And, the man with the unclean spirit says, what business do we have with each other? Jesus Nazarene, have you come to destroy us, etc. Now, what you'll see in some English translations is this might say Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus from Nazareth, because those translators are, working from a common understanding of what Nazarene means, and they're conveying that what Nazarene means here is person from Nazareth. And that's one of the things that we're really going to get into in question here is what does this really mean here? What was the original writer conveying when they called Jesus Nazarene? Were they identifying him as a person from Nazareth or something else? Now, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, and we look at this relationship where we have this identification of Jesus as Nazarene first, and then followed by this identification of I know who you are, the Holy One of God, or the Holy of God. What's interesting about this is that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, we find this very similar relationship. In Judges 13, in the Septuagint, with its Greek translation, what we have is this set of passages that's talking really about Samson, and it says that he shall be Nazir to God from the womb. And then later on, it goes on and it says, this child shall be holy to God. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the underlying Hebrew, what we have is the same word in both places. This is Nazir in Hebrew, reads right to left, of course. And then what the translators did for this is instead of just translating the word or transliterating the word, they did both. So what they did the first time is they transliterated Nazir into Greek so that it's phonetically the same. But then the second time they actually translated the word, which was a smart thing to do because now they've given the Greek reader knowledge of what the original word was and then also what it actually means. But what's interesting is we've got the same word in Hebrew in both places in the underlying scriptures, but then in Greek we've got Nazir and then holy to God, and we find the same relationship here. But of course, we have Nazir, not Nazir. We've got an A where we would have should have this is a epsilon iota instead of an alpha. So, but other than this variant on the vowel, we've got this similar relationship, which is, intriguing, raises some questions. But there's more, because shortly prior to that in Judges, we've got another literary relationship between the Gospel of Mark and the Jewish scriptures. And in what the man with the unclean spirit says, he says, "What business do we have with each other, and have you come to destroy us?" This also has a parallel in Judges to the story of Jephthah. And in the end, there in Greek, you can see that this parallel is even closer than what it may even look like in the English translation. So the thing about this is that this has to be understood in the broader context of the Gospel of Mark, and this is sort of key to my understanding of the Gospel of Mark is the fact that the entire story of the Gospel of Mark is really constructed from these literary relationships between the gospel narrative and the underlying Jewish scriptures. And this type of relationship where we've got this text in the gospel story and its parallels in the Jewish scriptures isn't something that's unique just to this one scene. This is something that we see all throughout the Gospel of Mark, and this is sort of how scene after scene after scene is constructed. And this is, I believe, key to really understanding the underlying meaning of this story. And so one of the ways that I go about understanding the Gospel of Mark is identifying these literary parallels between the text and the Jewish scripture, and then using that understanding of the Jewish scripture to inform my understanding of the gospel narrative. What does the writer of the gospel narrative mean, and what are they trying to get at with these relationships to the Jewish scriptures? Well, the story of Jephthah is an interesting one, because in this story, basically, Jephthah is a sort of bastard child, and he's hated by the other Israelites. They bully him and sort of drive him out of the community, and then later on they're being attacked by the Ammonites, and they need to have a somebody to help lead them in military victory against the Ammonites. And it turns out that Jephthah has developed into a competent a superior warrior and all this kind of stuff. So they come to Jephthah and they're begging him, please, come help lead us to victory against the Ammonites. And so then he says to them, did you not hate me and drive me from my father's house? And now you've come to me when you're in trouble. Obviously, we can see how this may relate to the story of Jesus, where Jesus gets driven out of his father's house, the temple. But the story goes on, though, and Jephthah does eventually agree to lead them. And then before going into battle against the Ammonites, he prays to the Lord and he says, if you help help me in this victory against the Ammonites, I'll do, whenever I return from battle, I'll sacrifice the first thing I see, no matter what it is and how valuable it is. I'll sacrifice it to you. And I swear that I'll do this now if you just help lead me to victory. So he goes off to war, comes back, and of course, the very first thing that he sees is his own child. So his child comes running out of the house and say, "Oh, Dad, I'm so glad you came back." And then Jeff just drops to his knees and starts to cry, and says, "Lord, why did it have to be, my own child?" So it's his daughter, and so he then agrees and goes on and sacrifices his daughter, kills his daughter as a sacrifice to the Lord. Now, obviously, we can see how this whole thing relates to the concepts in the gospel story. So I think there's very good reason to believe that this sort of relationship that has been created here by the writer, the construction of this scene, it is definitely related to these scriptures and has this sort of related thematic meaning. But what all comes out of this is that this certainly draws into question what Jesus Nazarene means. Is Jesus being called Nazarene because the man with the unclean spirit is identifying him as a person who came from this tiny village called Nazareth, or is he being called Nazarene as meaning one who is holy to God? And this is the way that it's used, of course, in the original Septuagint. What we have is the same word being used twice, once with the word itself, and the second time with its underlying meaning. And that appears to really be how it's being used by the writer here as well. Jesus isn't being called a Nazarene because he's from Nazareth. He's being called Nazarene because he's holy to God. Now, why it's Nazarene and not Nazarene with an I, that's one of the things that is a part of the question here. So let's explain a little bit about this ENE ending. This ENE ending, like we see on the word Nazarene, signifies a type of person. But typically, this ENE ending would be feminine, so it would be like Mary Magdalene. The way this would normally be written in Greek would be in a masculine context would be enos instead of ENE. But there's also some other linguistic rules in Greek, and so what happens in Greek is whenever you're addressing somebody in the vocative voice, they would put an E on the end of the word. So in that case, what that means is, like, if I say, "Hey doctor, come here," I'm using the word doctor in the vocative case. I'm not describing a person. I'm calling him doctor and addressing him directly. But I could also say, tell that tell the doctor over there to come here. In that case, I'm not using it in the vocative sense. And in English, we don't change the word. It's doctor either way. In Greek, they do change. The word does change. And so Nazarenos would become Nazarene used in the vocative case. Now that the way it translates in English looks a little weird because you can't tell the difference between this masculine Nazarene and this feminine Magdalene, right? They look the same in English, but in the underlying Greek, you can tell the difference, because in the underlying Greek, what we've got is eta nu epsilon versus eta nu eta. It's just that in English we translate eta and epsilon both to the letter E. But so in Greek, you can tell the difference between these two. This is masculine in the vocative case, and this is feminine. So at any rate, that sort of explains why he's called Nazarene in that particular verse, even though really the more appropriate way to describe Jesus would be as Nazarenos. But this enos ending works very similar to the way that our an ending works, right? So if we would call somebody that's from Texas a Texan, or from Florida a Floridian, and this works very much the same way that we would call somebody a Nazarene or Nazarenos in Greek, and that could mean someone from Nazara or Nazaria. But just like this an ending in English, this enos ending in Greek could also mean that it can be describing somebody that has some other attribute, because it's really a way of describing somebody that belongs to a group. And that group can be people born in a place, or people of a certain religion or political affiliation or profession, just like we would say Christian, Republican, mathematician, just as we would Floridian. And so this is the same issue that we have, is that Jesus could be getting called a Nazarenos because he's from a place, or because he is a type of person. The big problem that we have is that what the word Nazarenos would imply is that Jesus is from a place called Nazara, or that he is a person who is Nazar. But neither one of those are real words. There was never any place called Nazara or Nazara, and there was no word of Nazar. There was Nazir, but that's not Nazar. Now, as we've seen in Luke and Matthew, Jesus was said to have come from Nazareth or Nazara. And that word appears to have been a supposition that somebody arrived at by working backwards from Nazarene or Nazarenos. They saw the word Nazarenos, and you would assume from that it meant that this is a person from a town called Nazareth. Just as if in English, if somebody is called a Texan, you assume they're from Texan, or you may assume they're from Texa if you've never heard of the word before. But there was no real place called Nazareth. So it's clear with the use of that Nazareth term that somebody was looking at the word Nazarene or Nazarenos and trying to conjecture, what must this mean? It must mean that he's from a place called Nazareth, even though no such place existed. Now, this might be similar to if we heard somebody called a Christian and we didn't know what a Christian was, and we didn't think it was a Christian, we might assume that they're from some place called Cresta. And if you make that assumption and then you write, well, this person was, Billy Bob, who's a Christian, comes from Cresta. But what if Christian was a variant spelling of Christian? Then you would be completely wrong, right? That would really be describing the religious beliefs, not where they're from. So, and I'm not proposing that this is the answer here, but it's a question to ask: is Nazarene a misinterpretation or misreading somehow of Nazarene? Was Nazarene the original word that later got misread? That's one possibility. I don't think that's necessarily the only possibility here. But what we've got is the fact that in Hebrew, the real name of the real village that is called now Nazareth is Nazareth. And what we, in this position, this is not what would be translated into a zeta. This should have been translated in Greek, most likely into a sigma, because this way this would be spelled is with a tsaid here, and so the real pronunciation of the name of the village would be Nazareth. And so this is what the problem that we have is we have this word Nazareth that doesn't really correspond to anything. It can't translate directly to Nazir, because where we have an epsilon iota or an iota in the real word the way that it should be transliterated, we have an alpha, and where we should have a sigma, we have a zeta if we're trying to get to the name of the town. So it's just sort of a word that appears in the Gospel of Mark for the first time, and it's difficult to place what it really is supposed to mean. Now, one possibility here is that what we had was an epsilon iota that was mistaken for an alpha. Now, I'm not saying that that is what happened, but it's something to consider as a possibility. Here, this just is some random ancient Greek text, and we've got an alpha here and an epsilon iota, and obviously you can tell the difference between those two here, but maybe with some sloppy writing, maybe this could be written in a way too close together that they might look the same. I don't know. But let's move on and look at the use of this throughout all these gospels and how they relate to one another. So if we look at the Gospel of Luke, right, we have this mention of Nazareth, and it says that Jesus came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And then later on, we have the exact parallel to what we find in Mark 1 of the passage about the man with the unclean spirit addressing Jesus as Nazarene. Now, if you see this word Nazarene and you just, knowing the rules of Greek, try to decipher what it means, one thing that one conclusion you might reach is exactly this conclusion right here. Because this could mean, in Greek, the word by itself could mean a person who was raised in Nazareth. And that appears to be what happened here, is that the writer of most likely Proto-Luke saw this word. They didn't really know what it meant or hadn't seen it before, but they conjectured and assumed what it must mean is that Jesus was raised in Nazareth, and this is what they've added to their story. But here's what's interesting. In the Gospel of Mark, of course, and all of our versions of the Gospel of Mark, here we have the word Nazareth, which is closer to our spelling of Nazareth. But if this existed in the Gospel of Mark when somebody was deriving Proto-Luke or any version of Luke that you may think of, they would have known that this is the spelling of the town. They would have seen this, and they said, oh, he came from Nazareth. They wouldn't have needed to conjecture that the name of the town was Nazareth. So the fact that they've spelled it this different way would seem to indicate that they didn't have this word available to them to provide them guidance as to what the correct spelling should be. So that's one of our first clues as to whether or not this word Nazareth was really there to begin with. But let's go on and look at Matthew. So if we compare the same scene or the same verse in Matthew to Mark, right? In Mark it says, that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. In Matthew, we have almost exactly, Matthew has copied this verse almost identically, except it doesn't say that he came from Nazareth. So this would seem to be an example of a witness to a version of the Gospel of Mark in which from Nazareth wasn't present, and that Matthew would appear to be providing a copy of an earlier version of Mark in which this was not there. And again, Matthew also uses this Nazara or Nazara term as well, whether he's copying that from proto-Luke or whatever. Again, if Nazareth was in Mark and Matthew was reading this in Mark, why would he later have used this other spelling, given that in so many cases Matthew follows Mark over Luke anyways? So the fact that he's also continuing to use this spelling against this other spelling is interesting. And of course, he doesn't even use the word Nazareth here at all, where he's copying that verse. But what about some other examples in Matthew? So if we look at the scene where after Jesus is arrested, that they're identifying, hey, Peter, you were with you were a follower of Jesus, and then Peter denies it. In the Gospel of Mark here, this is one of the cases where Jesus is called a Nazarene in the Gospel of Mark, and it says you are also with Jesus the Nazarene. He denies it, and they say this is one of them. But here's what's interesting. Now it says, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too. You're Galilean also. Well, the problem here is that this is actually the first use of the term Galilean in the entire Gospel of Mark, and nobody has been called a Galilean. So if you're a Galilean also, who else is a Galilean? Well, we can assume, and what people have, most people have done is they've assumed that Jesus being called a Nazarene here, that people knew that Nazareth was in Galilee, and so by calling him a Nazarene, that implied that he was a Galilean, and so calling Peter a Galilean too can still make sense. It would be like saying, you were with Jesus from Waco. Surely you're one of his friends because you're from Texas too. And you would imply that you must know that Waco is in Texas and all these kind of things. Maybe. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. But what's interesting is that when we look at Matthew, for the parallel verse to verse 67 in Mark, we have in Matthew calls Jesus a Galilean. Now, Matthew does go on later to call Jesus a Nazarene, but he doesn't do so in the parallel verse to this one. He does it here where in Mark it says this is one of them. Matthew rewrites that, and Matthew has sort of rewritten it, a good bit, and then he sort of explains this, you're a Galilean too. Even the way you talk gives you away. So here, this is sort of a, hey, you have a Galilean accent type of thing. But what's interesting is, how can we explain, why would Matthew do this? Why, if Matthew has Mark as the example, and he's following that, or even Proto-Luke doesn't, or the Gospel of Luke doesn't differ much from this either. Why would he choose to say, well, where he called him a Nazarene here, I'm going to switch that to Galilean, and then I'm going to introduce Nazarene here. Now we've got the different spellings, and there's a whole bunch of stuff about Matthew, choosing a different spelling. But even if Matthew wanted to use this different spelling, he could have just simply changed the spelling of this word. Why would he try to rewrite this thing and move it to a different place? Well, it may make more sense if we consider that this was the original version of what was in Mark. You were with Jesus the Galilean, and then he denied it. Surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean too. Now this you're a Galilean too has a matching identification of Jesus as a Galilean to draw this all together. Now this reference makes sense. It has another reference to Jesus being a Galilean to go against. And if this is what Matthew was working from, but Matthew wanted to introduce the identification of Jesus as a Nazarene, he wouldn't have had anything to guide him by. He would have chosen his own place to introduce it. So Matthew introduces this identification of Jesus as a Nazarene. Well, if somebody's harmonizing Mark back to Matthew, and they have this that they're working from, and they want to make it look more like Mark, well, they could have done exactly what Mark did, right? They could have said this here, but in order to do that, they would have had to more significantly rewrite and change the Gospel of Mark. So if they're wanting to harmonize Mark to Matthew in the most economical way possible, with making the fewest changes to Mark, but still getting Mark to agree with Matthew, the easiest thing they can do in order to bring this in line with this reference to being a Nazarene is to simply change the reference to Jesus being a Galilean here to a Nazarene, because now all they have to do is change one word, right? They don't have to rewrite a whole sentence and all this kind of stuff. So now with the one word change, they basically harmonized Mark to Matthew. But in the process of doing so, they left this little clue of the fact that this originally said Galilean. So another example in the Gospel of Mark. Now, in fact, every single case where Mark identifies Jesus as a Nazarene, there is no parallel in the Gospel of Matthew or really any of the other Gospels, which is very interesting. So this is another one. This comes from slightly earlier, actually, in Mark 10, where we've got Jesus curing the blind man on the way out of Jericho. Jesus is identified as a Nazarene as he's passing by. The blind man comes out. The Gospel of Matthew, however, again, doesn't identify him as Nazarene. It just says that Jesus was passing by and he cries out, blah, blah, blah. Now, Matthew has rewritten this a bit. There's definitely some more substantial changes here. In here we've got two blind men instead of the one. And I think what has happened here is there's been here we have two names, Bartimaeus and Timaeus. Now, this is really all describing one person, but something has gone on where Matthew has interpreted these two names as two people. Exactly how and why, I'm not sure. But regardless, Matthew, again, fails to identify Jesus as Nazarene here. Why? I mean, he could even use his own spelling. Why drop it out? Then shortly after, Matthew has this thing where after the triumphal entry, Jesus is announced to the people of Jerusalem that this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. And in fact, out of all the Gospels, this is the only place where the people in the narrative are informed that Jesus is from Nazareth in Galilee. Even earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, of course, the narrator tells the reader that Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee, but this is the only place where the characters in the story are informed where Jesus is from Nazareth in Galilee. And what's interesting about this in Matthew is that this is sort of, I presented this out of order a little bit, but this sort of sets up what goes on here with identifying Jesus as a Nazarene, meaning a person from Nazareth in Galilee. And the writer, what they've done by the introduction of this passage here is they've introduced this description of Jesus so that it would be, there's a reason why people in Jerusalem would know that Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee and would be able to identify him as such. And that sort of sets the stage for this usage here. We don't have anything like that in Mark, right? So one of the interesting things in the Gospel of Mark is that other than that first instance where the demonic spirit identifies Jesus as a Nazarene, that title is never used by anyone again until the healing of the blind man. But the thing about it is, how would anybody even know? There's nothing that sets up in the Gospel of Mark the use of this terminology to identify him, right? Other than one person who is a demon that Jesus silenced and said, shh, don't tell anybody. So this really wouldn't have been a title, according to the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus would have been known by. Matthew here is establishing that this would be a title that he would be known by. And as you can see here, Mark doesn't have that. Now, when we compare this to Luke, it gets interesting because in Luke, we do have this same parallel. And we might think, well, okay, if the Gospel of Luke has this, then maybe that confirms that this was originally there. And that is that is certainly a possibility. But what's interesting is this is the one case where the Gospel of Luke uses the quote unquote Matthean spelling against the Markan spelling, which is quite intriguing. Now, another thing about this is the fact that we do have quite a good reference to what this passage said exactly in Marcion's Evangelion, because from the work which is known by Adamantius, it's really an anonymous work. That's a 4th century writing that purports to quote directly from the Evangelion. It's this, sort of apologetic work that's trying to use Marcion's scriptures against him to disprove his beliefs, but they provide direct quotes from the Evangelion, and one of the quotes is this particular passage, because this is one that drew a lot of attention due to the Son of David comment. But in that, it's quoted as coming from the Evangelion without the Nazarios in it. So we have the Evangelion, which doesn't have the Nazarios. We have Matthew that doesn't have the Nazarios. We have Luke, canonical Luke now, that does have Nazarios, which is the unique spelling in Luke against the other two Nazarenos spellings. So if Luke copies the Markan spelling in 2 other cases, or at least one, why switch to this other one here if they had this to go on? So a lot of this is conjectural, but what I think a good explanation for this is that this was really introduced by the writer, by the canonical writer of Luke, using the Matthean spelling, and that when Mark was then put into the 4 gospel collection, it was being harmonized against the other gospels, and in this case, they added this in harmony with Luke, using the Markan spelling, keeping it consistent with the way that it was spelled within Mark. This would have been added by the writer of canonical version of Luke. This was added by the editor of the collection. So that's what I think has happened there, which is why we again don't have it here in Matthew, even though we have this more similar passing by, as in both cases, where in Luke we have the passing by as well. All right, last example here in the empty tomb scene. Again, Jesus is called a Nazarene, and not a big deal here. I mean, it's nothing complicated. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. Matthew, we have almost again exactly the same. Matthew has copied this almost identically, except again leaves out the Nazarene identification. So why would Matthew, if he's got this to work from, why drop it out? So Matthew again appears to be a witness to a version of this scene that didn't contain the Nazarene. And this is sort of a double identifier here. We've got Jesus the Nazarene, and what the underlying Greek really says is Jesus the Nazarene, the crucified, sort of identifying him, who Jesus is. It's not just any Jesus; it's the one who was crucified twice in a row. And then on top of all of those things, we have the fact that in Mark 6, we have this passage about Jesus coming to his hometown. What I think has happened here is that at the time that Mark 6:1 was written, there was no identification of Nazareth as a place that Jesus was from, and that's why this didn't say that he returned to Nazareth or he came into Nazareth. It just says hometown, because there was no identified hometown at the time that this was originally written. So if we compare Mark to Matthew, what we see is that we've got in the opening of Matthew and the birth narrative, we're told that Jesus, was born in Nazareth, which is in order to fulfill the prophecy that he would be Nazarios, or a Nazarite. And what's interesting about this is that we do have two spellings here for Matthew. The earliest, we have an early fragment, an early 2nd century fragment that happens to contain this passage that has the spelling Nazara. Now, in Matthew 4:13, this Nazareth spelling is preserved. So even in later copies, it's still there. And in 21:10, we have the spelling with the theta on the end with Nazareth. Now, the thing about that is that we don't have an early example of this passage. We just happen to have an early fragment that has this, but we don't have it here. So what many scholars think, and well, not many, but the few that have commented on this, because many scholars don't even get into this, but few that have commented on this have noted that it's likely that these were all said Nazara originally, and that later scribes are the ones that made these changes to these other spellings. This one was likely preserved because in the Gospel of Luke, there's a parallel that has the exact same spelling, so that would have kept them from changing it. But what we see is that this has, of course, no parallel. There is no parallel here, or Matthew has a parallel to Mark here, but doesn't use the word Nazareth. Matthew has no parallel to this usage, because in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark 21 through 40, which is where this occurs, is sort of like the early miracles of Jesus. All of that is summarized in Matthew in a couple of sentences before he goes on to the Sermon on the Mount. So unfortunately, we don't know how Matthew would have treated this, but it doesn't appear to be something that was intentionally dropped in order to avoid the word. It's just that Matthew was summarizing the early miracles. But then in every other case where these descriptions of Nazarene exist in Mark, there are parallels that exist in Matthew, but they don't have the word there. And in the one place where they're sort of used in the same scene, they're not used in the same places in that scene. So that's all quite interesting. Now, if we look at the Gospel of John, to move on to the other gospel that mentions that Jesus is from Nazareth, and also calls him a Nazarenos or Nazorios. In the Gospel of John, there's only one place that says Jesus came from the town of Nazareth, and that's in John 1 in the introduction. Now, getting into the Gospel of John is complicated because the Gospel of John is probably literarily one of the most, or textually one of the most complex in how it was developed. And in fact, I think the work, The Literary Origin of the Gospel of John by Howard Teeple, does a really good job of going over a lot of these complexities. And there, Teeple identifies basically 4 different writers or 4 different sources that went into John. But one of those that Teeple identifies is the final editor. And the final editor, of course, many people recognize John chapter 21 as having been written by a different person than the rest of the Gospel of John. It's basically a second ending after a first ending. It's quite different in its character. And so the majority of biblical scholars now recognize John chapter 21, not written by the same person that wrote the rest of the Gospel of John. But what many scholars, think is that John chapter 21 is its own separate thing. One person wrote that, and that's all they did. They didn't change the rest of it. What Teeple gets into in The Literary Origin of the Gospel of John is identifying the fact that the writer who wrote John chapter 21 also made other revisions throughout the Gospel of John. And he calls this the Orthodox reviser of that gospel. And so if we look at the one place that mentions that Jesus came from Nazareth in the Gospel of John, we know that John chapter 21, of course, is written by a very Orthodox writer. It goes through many different sort of key Orthodox claims about Peter and the beloved disciple and all this kind of stuff. And we look at the passage in which Jesus is said to be from Nazareth in John, we have this same sort of hyper Orthodox passage, which is very interesting in the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John is otherwise a largely Gnostic type gospel. It actually diverges from orthodoxy in many ways. But it looks like what happened in the Gospel of John is that the proto-canonical version of John was still quite a Gnostic work, and then the final editor went through and sort of orthodized it, and at least made a few key changes to bring it in line with Orthodox, with proto-Orthodox thinking. And one of those here is what we see. So what we see is, in John chapter 21, it talks about after he's met Peter and Paul, we're then introduced to Philip and Nathaniel, and then they say, oh, this guy was written about by Moses and the law and the prophets, which is a really key giveaway to orthodoxy, because this term law and prophets is something that Orthodox Christians, believe that Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets, and most of the other heretics, quote unquote, did not. So this is a very Orthodox style passage in the midst of what is an otherwise largely Gnostic type gospel. He's the son of Joseph. And he's an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, implying, of course, that most other Israelites are deceitful. And then this is where we're told that Jesus is from Nazareth. And nothing else about this is ever mentioned again in the rest of the gospel. There's no other real association of Jesus with Nazareth other than this one passage. And so what I think has happened in this case is that this was all put in by the Orthodox reviser. Now, what we do find in the Gospel of John, though, is some mentions of Jesus being Nazarian, again, using the same spelling that we find in Matthew. And what's interesting here about these uses is that these uses do not indicate that what this means is person from the town of Nazareth. These uses indicate that what this means is the same thing that it appears to mean that Nazarene means in Mark chapter 1, which is the Holy One of God. So Jesus, they're saying we're looking for Jesus, the Nazarian, and he says, I am he, and then they draw back and fall to the ground. Well, why? Well, because he is, quote unquote, the chosen one, right? And then here we've got this, identification here of Jesus, the Nazarian, the King of the Jews. Jesus, saying that this is supposed to mean Jesus from the small town of Nazareth doesn't really seem to make sense. And when we compare this to Mark, what we see is, of course, in Mark, it only says the King of the Jews, but then shortly after, Jesus is called the Christ, the King of Israel. And it appears that what's happened in John is that this part of the scene in Mark doesn't exist in John, because he goes on to talk about the beloved disciple and all this other stuff. But it appears what the writer has done is they've taken this idea and they've incorporated it into the sign itself, and they're associating this word Christ with Nazarian. That being Nazarian is being the Christ. Those two are one and the same. And this is what we see here too, is that he is the Christ, he is the Nazarian, which is why he's somebody special, not because he's from some small town called Nazareth. And Thomas Topp actually has a whole paper on where he talks about the identification of Jesus as a Nazarite in the Gospel of John. Now, what Thomas Topp thinks about this is that he considers John a unity that was all written at one person at one time by one person, and he thinks the introduction of Jesus being from Nazareth in the beginning is used as a contrast against the real idea that he's actually, that this word means something different than person from Nazareth. I think he gets a lot right in this analysis. I think where he gets off the track here is assuming that the Gospel of John is a unity all written by one person. I think that what's really happened is this mention of Nazareth is introduced much later, and that the original writer wasn't trying to create a contrast. The original writer just had no concept of Jesus being from Nazareth at all. They were using Nazarian to mean this Holy One of God that Topp, correctly identifies in the later usages. All right. So with all this, which I know is taking quite a bit to get through, sorry. What we see is that of all of these uses, right, of Nazareth and Nazarene um, in the Gospel of Mark, there's only two of them in the Gospel of Mark that indicate that Jesus is from a town called Nazareth. Of course, the very first one where it says that he's from Nazareth, that obviously indicates that he's from Nazareth. And then in Mark 14, Jesus being the Nazarene or Nazarios, basically, um, has to mean that he's from the town of Nazareth in that context in order for it to make any sense. Um, so it must mean person from a place called Nazareth in this usage. But these uses actually make more sense if they mean the Holy One of God. And throughout in the uses of Nazarios and John make the most sense to mean the Holy One of God, not person from a place. And so what I conclude is that in the Gospel of Mark in its proto-canonical form, prior to being put into a collection, this mention of Jesus being from Nazareth was not there. And this identification of Jesus being the Nazarene here in Mark 14 also was not there. It said he was from Galilee, not that he was Galilean, not Nazarene. These other two uses in Mark 10 and the ending, I suspect were not really there, but those could have been there, potentially. But even if so, they didn't mean that he was from Nazareth. They meant he was the Holy One of God. I think that really the only usage in Mark that is actually original is the one from Mark 123, which is part of the scriptural reference. That's the only one that is confirmed and supported by the Gospel of Luke, that it sort of copies it word for word and affirms that it was present. And we have the fact that it is built in this, using these literary references the way that so much else in Mark does. None of these other instances are affirmed by any other Gospels, and they have no sort of literary, deeper literary meaning to them. So the ultimate conclusions that we get to here, I think, for me, are that this use of Nazarene in Mark 124 is best understood as meaning one who is holy, not one who is from a town of Nazareth, right? And the spellings of Nazareth in the early manuscripts, the fact that we have these different variants, we have Nazara at first, which is what someone would sort of suppose Nazarene to mean, and then that's later changed to Nazareth or Nazareth as people started to realize, hey, there is no place called Nazara. There must be something else. And then they searched around and found this town called Nazareth, where there's a similar enough spelling, and so they started changing the word to Nazareth. Now, use of Nazara is, explained, as I just said, as something derived from Nazarene, because they didn't have, those early writers didn't have an example of a quote unquote correct spelling to work from, which we now find in Mark. And that the canonical version of Mark was then edited whenever it was put into a collection with the other Gospels, which we know happened in the middle of the 2nd century, because Irenaeus tells us, in 180 or by 180, that he is working with a 4-Gospel collection. That at that time, that's when some of this harmonization took place. And the same was done with John at that same time, that the mention that Jesus was from Nazareth was added to John, again with this more correct spelling, not the Nazara spelling. And all of this was done to harmonize these so-called heretical Gospels and make them more Orthodox and character. Now, what we've gone over here is just one example, and by itself, I will admit myself, maybe not. but what, again, in the book that I'm working on, that I really hope to have published by the end of this year, what I've got are half a dozen major examples that are even more impactful than this, which indicate even more clearly that the Gospel of Mark was modified. And I think the key thing to understand is that once you sort of break that dam and recognize that these Gospels as they exist in their canonical form are not original, and that they were edited collectively as a group, in the presence of one another in ways to conform them to each other. Once you can see that that's happened at least once you can verify at least one example of that happening, then that sort of breaks the wall, and then you realize, okay, that's what's gone on here. This is what's happened. And if we can see one example, we can, understand that there's bound to be more than one example, right? And this is the case of this business of Jesus being from Nazareth, and how that term developed, and how usage of this developed across the Gospels, is only one of what I think are many more examples that indicate that these Gospels were all edited collectively together to harmonize them, primarily to Matthew, but to each other, so that they contained more agreements in the collection than what they actually originally had independently. So anyways, that's the end of what I've got. And Jacob, if you got any questions or comments you'd like to go to from there, we can get to it. I'm going to go back to this one slide. Leave it to you.
All right. I'll start with the super chat question that came in earlier. Actually, not too long ago. All right, here we go. Reinhard Schneider, thank you for your super chat. Why do scholars think that the Q source goes back to Jesus? That source could have come from any or several Jewish teachers or communities, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, there's many problems with the whole Q source theory. My personal view is that I don't think there was any Q source to begin with. There was no Q at all. I totally agree, however, with what was said there, as far as even if there was a sort of sayings document, those sayings could have come from anywhere. And in fact, what I would say is, when you read the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures, the Jewish scriptures are filled with sayings from the Lord. And the Lord said this, and the Lord said that, and the Lord said and the other. Many of those could be traced back to there. But my explanation for Q, is similar to Mark Goodall's, although I think his explanation gets things a little reversed, because he argues that Luke is derived from Matthew. But basically in Goodall's case against Q, what he argues is that, look, there was the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark was expanded by someone writing a longer narrative. They introduced a lot of new material, and then the other gospel writer derived their work from that longer work and copied directly from it. Now, the whole Q theory is trying to explain why Luke and Matthew share all these passages in common, under the assumption that they didn't copy from one another. So Luke and Matthew the Q theory is all about trying to explain agreements between Luke and Matthew, assuming that neither Luke didn't copy from Matthew and Matthew didn't copy from Luke. Now, in Goodacre's case against Q, he argues that Luke copied from Matthew. I think the far more likely case, and what I think several scholars are now coming around to, is that there was a proto-Luke that was very similar to the canonical version of Luke, and that Matthew is derived from proto-Luke. But the concept is still the same in terms of Mark Goodacre's case against Q, that Q wasn't an extra separate document. It's just the things that were introduced by one new writer and that were copied by another writer.
So basically, in your view, Proto-Luke basically substitutes for Q. Is that correct?
Yes, right. And the difference being is that Q wasn't just some list of sayings, it was additional dialogue that was added to the Gospel of Mark, which is even in the deciphering the Gospels, where I think I actually get it wrong in my discussions of that. But basically, what I say is that there's so much of Q, what is identified as Q, that is deeply intertwined with the Markan narrative. Like the passages, so many of them can't really just be separated out. They're not just really random sayings. They really do have a lot of context with things that are happening in the Gospel of Mark. And so that's why, I think it's quite clear that that is dialogue that was added to Mark. It's not just totally separate random sayings.
So when would you date Proto Luke?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think understanding the sequence of these things is much easier than understanding exactly when they were written. I mean, I would say that the Gospel of Mark had to have been written sometime after the First Jewish and Roman War, but it could have been written anywhere as late as after the Third Jewish or Second Jewish Roman War, whatever you call it, the Bar Kokhba revolt. And I don't, I don't have a way of I don't know of a way to really date it, and so if Mark could have been written in the late first century, the early second century, it had to have been written at least by around 130 or 135. But maybe it was written as early as 80. I don't know. And so Proto Luke, sort of depends on when Mark was written. And so I don't know. I would say sequencing it is easy, relatively easy. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy. Dating it is a lot harder.
Now, what kind of text do you think Proto Luke made use of? Did Proto Luke have access to an earlier version of Mark? And if so, what other sources did Proto Luke have in front of him?
Well, so I think that, well, I do think that the writer of Proto Luke had also a access to an earlier version of Acts, of what we now call Acts of the Apostles, but and actually I even think that the writer of Mark did too, because I think that an earlier version of Acts was the first thing that was actually written. That the first writing was actually the Pauline letter collection, along with a narrative about Paul that was paired with the Pauline letter collection, and those two things went together, and that was all one sort of group of one collection of writings, the Pauline letters and the narrative that corresponded to the Pauline letters. And the writer of Mark had that, the writer of Proto Luke had that, and the writer of Canonical Luke and Acts had that. All three of them had access to those writings. Is what I think to be the case. Now, this what I would call Proto Acts. Many people have speculated about this for a long time, and of course, a lot of conservative biblical scholars have long argued that Acts is based on an earlier journal from the real Luke, or whatever.
Does this
Now,
have
I
to
don't.
do with the we document, the we passages
Yeah,
in Acts?
right,
Okay.
right. The we passages. So, many conservative scholars have said, "Oh, the we passages are evidence that Acts is reliable because it's based on a real, live, firsthand account. It's like a real travel journal." Now, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but I do think the we passages do come from an earlier source document, and that the writers of Mark and multiple versions of Luke had access to that source document too.
So you think, if I understand you correctly, you think the we document, the we passages in Acts. Okay, there we go. I got it oriented correctly. So the we documents earlier, and you think Mark knows it, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Right.
Now, can you dive in a little bit more into that and expand on what makes you suspect Mark knew this proto-Acts that you're talking about.
Yeah, and this is something that I will cover, that I do cover in the new book that I'm working on. So it will be explained there in a lot more detail than I'll be able to give here. But um, basically, there's a lot of literary parallels between the Gospel of Mark and Acts of the Apostles, and many of those literary parallels are extremely strong and extremely tight, specifically in the first person portions of Acts, the we passages. So the we passages have distinctive literary parallels between Mark that don't even exist between Luke and Acts. Now, there are passages, some of them are shared between um, Luke and Acts, but there are some that are distinct to Mark and Acts and are not shared by Luke, because of course Luke copies from Mark and all this other stuff. But there are some that where we can show Mark. There are parallels between Acts and Mark that don't exist between Acts and Luke, um, and those parallels are interesting. You could still say, well, but maybe the writer of Acts was deriving his scene from Mark, because they would have had access to that maybe. But the way that the parallels go, they sort of make the most sense actually if Mark is deriving his scene from Acts, not the other way around. So I do get into that in the book of arguing that in many places it looks like Mark is derived from Acts, which of course many people would say can't possibly make sense because everybody agrees that Acts is a late document. But that's the canonical version of Acts. And so if Acts is built on an earlier source document, then that earlier source document would be what Mark would have been working from, not the canonical version of it.
Could you give us an example, like one instance where you think this is occurring, in which Mark is making use of proto-Acts?
Yeah. So there's two of the key ones, and I'll apologize because I have to just do this off the top of my head. I'm not gonna try to dig up everything here on my screen real quick. But so two key ones would be the Mark's confrontation of the what was it, the demoniac and the generis or generase, and and when Jesus predicts his binding, when he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to be bound and handed over to the Gentiles. Both of these have parallels in the Gospel of Mark, and interestingly in between Mark and Acts, and interestingly in Acts, in the scene, there's a scene in, I believe it's Acts 16, where Paul comes along and he meets a slave girl who's a fortune teller, and then she's says, "Oh, I know who you are. You're from the Most High God," and then possessed by a demon, and he casts the demon out of her, and then everybody gets mad at him because now she can no longer be a fortune teller. And there's direct literary parallels between this scene and the Gospel of Mark. Now, there's also parallels between the Gospel of Luke, because the Gospel of Luke copies exactly from the Gospel of Mark. But then in the other scene where Jesus says he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles, there's exact literary parallels between this and Acts, where Paul gets bound and says he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles when he's talking to the Ephesians before he gets ready to make his final trip to Jerusalem. And the interesting thing about that is that it makes far more sense for Paul to be handed over to the Gentiles. And the way this all plays out is completely different in the two different books. Now, we know that Paul was called the quote unquote apostle to the Gentiles. And the way that Acts sort of plays out is that Paul is saved by the Romans from the Jews. So Paul goes to Jerusalem, he gets convicted, the Jews are trying to kill him, and he gets handed over to the Gentiles, which is his salvation. He ends up being saved by them. They take him and he goes on to Rome. And of course, everybody always knows, well, Paul lives happily ever after in Acts, but then all the other stories say that he was killed by Nero. But in the Gospel of Mark, of course, it works out very differently. Jesus gets handed over to the Gentiles who execute him. But in terms of how this all, works out, the way that the use of the Gentiles and Paul's relationship to the Gentiles and his salvation by the Gentiles is all a part of his core narrative that goes back to the Pauline letters and the whole story about Paul and Paul being ultimately saved by the Gentiles, making that a sort of essential part of the Pauline story, whereas it's really not in the Jesus story.
All right. So far we don't have any more super chats, so I think we'll go ahead and close. And before we close, could you remind the audience a little bit about your book, the book that you released a while back, Deciphering the Gospels, Prove Jesus Never Existed?
Yep. So I got Deciphering the Gospels, Proves Jesus Never Existed. I think it was published in 2018. It's available on Amazon, and basically it argues that the Gospel of Mark was written after the First Jewish and Roman War, and that the writer of the Gospel of Mark used a Pauline letter collection, that the story is based on the Pauline letter collection, and the writer's interpretation of the events of the First Jewish and Roman War in the context of the Pauline letters, and that the writer uses the Jewish scriptures to tell a story about how sort of the Jews followed the same activities of their ancestors, and sort of makes this parallel narrative using the Jewish scriptures to the events that led up to the destruction of the so-called First Temple by the Babylonians, and sort of integrates this with the Pauline letters, and that's where the Gospel of Mark came from, and that all the other Gospels are derived from that story. And so that's what I basically explain in that book. And then in the new book that I'm working on, I basically take that thesis and build upon it and provide a lot more evidence for that, as well as sort of making the case that the Gospels in their current form have been heavily modified from their original versions.
Well, all right. I have the link to purchase R.G. Price's book in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment as well. And that being said, R.G. Price, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.